are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar. My name is Hilary Beach, and I work for the Webinar Coordinator's Home Circuit. Tonight, we are joined by Jim Virgona, who is talking about the effects of temperature on pasture production. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This control panel will be at the top right corner of your screen. There is a red arrow on the left of the control panel which collapses and reinstates it if you want to get a better look at your screen. You should be able to hear us, but we cannot hear you. Please type the questions as we go through the presentation in the box provided. Please make these questions as succinct as possible, and I will relay them to Jim at the end of the webinar. Introducing our presenter tonight, Jim Virgona. He has been involved with pasture agronomy. Do you like that picture, Jim? Involved with pasture agronomy.
I don't like that picture, no.
For the last 25 years, working with the New South Wales DPI as an academic at CSU and now as an independent consultant in his own business, Graminus Consulting. Graminus Consulting covers New South Wales Riverina, Southwest Slopes and beyond. Jim's area of expertise include pasture establishment, grazing management, species evaluation and integration of livestock and cropping enterprises. Jim has developed a keen interest in understanding and influencing farm management throughout his career. Wonderful. I will just give Jim the control and we can get started.
Do I just hit share my screen?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Jim.
Hello, everybody, and thanks to Hilary. I think we're ready to go now. So, yeah, tonight it's the effects of temperature on... Oh, I've got to get rid of this stupid thing. No, I want to get rid of it. Go away. Hilary, how do I get rid of that stupid thing so it's not on the screen?
Just the orange button, it has an arrow, it should collapse it.
Gotcha. Yep. Gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so today it's the effects of temperature on pasture production. Actually, oh yeah, forget about that bit. Yeah, forget about me. Now, the advertised questions today, if you looked at the MLA business, was that I got sent, when is cold temperature the limiting factor? How does temperature impact nitrogen response, and how does temperature impact plant production in different perennial species? Because I could, I just changed those questions. So instead, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the effect of temperature on the growth and development of plants. And then I'm going to look at temperature and pasture growth, particularly an example from New Zealand, which is a nice little experiment that I show people from time to time. And then some work that I've done recently, just looking at the impact, well, just looking at winter pasture growth rates and through time in a changing climate. And then I won't look at air temperature versus soil temperature. I've given up that one. But what I haven't put in that list just then, but then we'll go and have a look at some of the reasons why we might get a response to nitrogen even though it's cold, because that was one of the briefs I was given as well. Temperature of plants. Temperature play, this is a very brief part. I want to whiz through it, but I just wanted people to get a bit of an idea of just what temperature does to plants and the major role it has in plant development, and how temperature is measured or expressed in development and growth studies. Now, development is the progress from one stage to another. It is not growth. It is not how big the plant is. It's measured by, if you like, for example, how quickly the leaves appear, or how quickly seeds emerge, the leaf appearance rate, the flowering date, length of the grain filling period. They're all developmental things, and temperature is a major influence on the rate of plant development. So any of those things, the rate at which plants emerge, etc., is dictated largely by temperature, not just temperature alone, but largely by temperature. Now, in the way that studies are normally done that show this, and many of you will be familiar with this from other contexts, is that temperature is related to development or growth by accumulating the average daily temperature minus the base temperature. Now I'm going to explain all of those, define all of those terms for you. So you'll understand this in a sec when we get through it. So the average temperature for a day is just the maximum temperature plus the minimum temperature divided by 2. So I don't know, yesterday in Wagga it was like, it was about a 10-degree maximum and a 6-degree minimum. That would make it an 8-degree average. Pretty simple sort of stuff. The base temperature is the temperature at which no progress in terms of growth or development or whatever we're examining is made. So in other words, if growth completely and utterly stops at 3 degrees Celsius, then 3 degrees Celsius is the base temperature. So, and sometimes this cumulative temperature, which I'm just going to show you an example of over the page, is also called a heat sum or a heat unit or a thermal unit, and it's expressed as day degrees. Here's an example. I've given you for a week there, I've got the minimum temperatures and the maximum temperatures for somewhere. I don't know where that is because I made it up. The average temperature is just below that. And then below that is the average temperature minus a base temperature of 3 degrees, right? So the cumulative day degrees, I'm just accumulating from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday onwards. So by the end of the week, I've accumulated 53.1 day degrees, or if you like, heat units, or whatever you want to call them. Another way to look at this is waiting time for temperature. So in other words, it's pretty obvious sort of stuff. During a warm day, processes which are sensitive to temperature are going to proceed a lot faster than during a cold day. So we weight the warm day more by using its average temperature minus base temperature than the cold day. It's as simple as that. And you'll see why I'm doing this in just a moment, I hope. Here's an example of what, now, unfortunately, a lot of the examples I'll do is probably have to do with crop development. Because so much more work's been done. But in crop development for a cultivar, an old cultivar called Olympic, the thermal units, another that term, that cumulative temperature measure, with a base temperature of 3, if you have a look at that, that's TB, 78 day degrees are needed to go from sowing to emergence, all right? For this cultivar, a further 315 day degrees were required to go from sowing right through to stem extension. Now, don't worry about the PTUs. They're photothermal units. That the day length is involved in those, so we won't worry about those, Joe, because I'm not talking about it. But look at the last one, from anthesis, which is another, with a fancy word for flowering, right through to maturity. This cultivar required 416 day degrees with a base temperature of 8. So in other words, grain growth stops at 8 degrees. So cumulative temperature above 8 degrees would give you, once you'd accumulated 416, would give you, would denote when maturity is happening. All right, all good. I hope it's clear so far. It won't get much more technical than this, I hope. Here's an example from New Zealand. I usually show this experiment for other reasons. It's to convince people to fertilise pastures and make money. I don't know why they need convincing, but nevertheless, some do. Now, here we go. Here's this example from New Zealand. This is, and I did tell Hillary I was going to annotate everything perfectly tonight, and I haven't. But this is in the by Mills and co-workers, one of whom is Derek Moot in New Zealand, about 2006, I think, in the Grassland Association proceedings. I think that's where it's from. It's a very simple experiment, and the growth rates will are quite phenomenal. It's done at Christchurch. And we've got a pure cocksfoot pasture It's almost pure cocksfoot, so you don't have to worry about anything else. And it's the experiment goes for 2 years. There are 2 levels of 2 treatments. One treatment is watering, where there is either irrigation or rain-fed, and the other treatment is plus nitrogen, where in 2003, the first year of the trial, they gave it 800 kilos of nitrogen. That's right, folks, 1,600 kilos of urea over the year. And the next year, they just doubled up on that and gave it 1,600 kilos of nitrogen or 3,200 kilos of urea. Not something that most of us would attempt at home. In addition to this, they ensured a basal application of phosphorus and sulfur was made, so neither were limiting. Now, the results are over. That's not the main reason I'm showing this. We'll just have a look at it. So here are our treatments: irrigation plus nitrogen, irrigation minus nitrogen, rain-fed plus nitrogen, rain-fed minus nitrogen. We are on the Canterbury Plain at Lincoln University, and here are the results. Now look, in tonnes per hectare. So over the year, irrigation plus nitrogen, cocksfoot pasture grew 22 tonnes, and not much different in the following year. So it really, I mean, that's, look, most of us would be lucky to grow 10 tonnes. 22 tonnes is just exceptional, right? Interestingly, though, if the nitrogen wasn't poured on and we were relying only on rainfall, the amount of annual growth was 7.5 or 5, depending on the year, so much lower. And I usually make this point here. I'll just put the next ones up. Minus nitrogen plus irrigation, about 10 tonnes. Rain-fed plus nitrogen, around 15 to 16 tonnes. So the normal message I use for that is this is to give you a bit of context. Normal message I use is, look, you know, if pastures are properly fertilised, forget about nitrogen now, just put fertiliser in your head. If they're properly fertilised, they can grow when the rain's available. Nice message. But what I really want to show you, so that's the experiment, but what I want to show is what they did with some of the data with respect to temperature. Here it is. Now, this is why I just did the accumulated temperature thing with you, so you could understand this. So this is now the, I've got to get this right. This is, I think for the 2 different years, correct? Yes, correct. Okay, the top line is irrigated plus nitrogen, and the hollow symbols and the solid symbols are just for the 2 different years. There's nothing worth talking about there. So when you plot accumulated dry matter versus accumulated temperature, you get this lovely straight line. There's a bit of a squiggle on it for other factors that are obviously influencing it. But as you can see, if you've eliminated nutrition and if you've eliminated soil moisture as a limitation, right, then basically temperature is having a huge influence on growth. In fact, the slope of that line is pretty interesting. Now they used for that accumulated temperature, they've used a basal temperature of 3 degrees again. Now, worth noting, the slope of that line is about 7. So what it's saying is, above average temperatures of 3, they're getting a growth rate of 7 kilos per hectare for every degree above 3. Now, that's quite exceptional. If they didn't put nitrogen on, you get this, oh my goodness, what's happened? Thank you. You get this line down the bottom, which is irrigated but no nitrogen, and the slope of that line is about 3. So there's 3 kilos accumulating for every degree of temperature accumulated above 3. So so that's a very interesting experiment, and that's just showing, all I wanted you to see out of that is just how there is a direct relationship in the end between temperature, accumulated temperature and accumulated dry matter, and how tight that can be when everything else is controlled. However, it's pretty difficult to control everything. And why should there be such a relationship? Well, we'll just look at growth in a very, very simple way. That growth is the difference between the amount of photosynthesis that's going on, that is getting carbon as carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's on the positive part of the ledger for any pasture. And, you know, there are various types of plants which have different optimum temperatures for photosynthesis. There's a so-called C3 species. I'm not going to explain any of that to you, but they're the cool season species. And there are many grasses that are called C4 grasses that are warm season grasses. The warm season ones don't perform at low temperature at all. And have a high temperature optimum for photosynthesis. The cool season ones, of course, do very well at sort of 15 to 20 degrees and start falling over in the mid 30s. All right, so that's the gain, and photosynthesis is directly related to temperature. I'll show you that in a sec. That's one part of it. The second part of it. So that's the positive part. So the leaves are out there during the day in a canopy, sun comes out, they start photosynthesizing and convert that stuff to carbohydrates, which is now available to the plant. The plant, though, has to do some work to build and maintain its structure, if you like. So there's maintenance work to do and there's building work to do. And to do that, plants have to literally burn off some of that carbohydrate to do the work to get it done, much as we have to burn off excessive body weight in order to do some exercise. God knows I need to do more. Now, so interestingly, while there's a sort of relationship between temperature and photosynthesis, there's an exponential relationship between temperature and respiration. I'll show you a little picky of that in a moment. So as temperature goes up, more or less by 10 degrees, respiration doubles. For every 10-degree increase in temperature, you get a doubling of the respiratory rate, the respiratory loss. So just to some what I was just talking about there, this is a C3 cool season species with the temperature optimum around 20-25. C4s not doing so well at low temperature with an optimum around 30 to 35. It's a little bit again on this axis here, the y-axis, I have photosynthesis. Forget what it says, just call it photosynthesis. Down here I have temperature. Here I have wheat again. That's sort of like optimally around 20. Maize is a C4 grass, summer growing grass. Absolutely hopeless once you get down to about 15 degrees, but with a huge rate of photosynthesis at very high temperatures in the 35s. But even amongst the C3 species, the cool season species, you get some adaptation. Look at this snow tussock here. It has its maximum photosynthesis is low, but it's reached at around 10 degrees. So there's adaptation to temperature, adaptation of environment by which we can see through the response to temperature. Now, that's photosynthesis. Now, I want you to just don't pay any attention to this except for what's in the red box, okay? So here on the y-axis, we've got rate of CO2 exchange. So if it's positive, it's photosynthesis. If it's negative, it's respiration. Remember, photosynthesis taking CO2 in, respiration burning CO2 off. Now what you can see there is, and this is just for a canopy, and I can't remember what type of canopy it is, it's white clover. This is for canopy that would be a full canopy, a leaf area index of 3, but don't worry about that, just look up here. So what have we got? This here up here, PG, is the gross amount of photosynthesis that goes on in a day. So that's all the photosynthesis that comes in. And here, down here is the respiration rate, right? Okay, and the difference between the two is the net gain by the plant. Now, this is only during the day. Imagine what happens at night. The plant keeps respiring, but there's no photosynthesis coming in. So therefore, you get something like this, that in the proportion of carbon loss that's in respiration that's taken up in photosynthesis can be quite high. Cropping, anywhere between 30 to 60% can be lost. Tallgrass prairie, I dare say somewhere in the States, wherever I got this from, 60, around 60%. So in other words, it's almost like the plants are walking 3 steps forward and taking 1 or 2 steps back. But that's just the cost of doing things. The important thing to note here is that as temperature goes up and up and up, respiration plays more and more of a role, particularly in those C3, those cool season plants. Goodo, all well and good. And here's an example of the respiration of white clover. I don't really care about the adaptation stuff here, but here's temperature on the x-axis. Here's respiratory loss on the y-axis, and you can see that exponential increase as the temperature starts going up. So that's pretty interesting sort of stuff. You know a little bit now about what's going on in very basic ways of what might be going on in terms of development and some impacts on the major impacts on growth with temperature, all very well. Plant development is closely related to temperature. Crop and pasture growth also directly related to temperature, but photosynthesis and respiration differ in their response. You've seen that. What about pastures in Australia? Well, I think it's good to it's nice to have that New Zealand experiment in your head, but it's good to step away from it too and just say, well, what about the realities of the system? You know, the fact that there are many more other limitations. You can't take away every limitation. And so and what might they be? Well, things like soil moisture, waterlogging, grazing management. For instance, I'll give you an example. That New Zealand experiment, they always cut down to 3 centimetres. So there's always, you know, well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of the time there is green leaf left, a fair bit of it after grazing, which is not, well, we know in many situations in Australia is not always the case. And then, of course, there's nutrition, which varies across, and a whole lot of other things that we don't need to go into. So if you want to be realistic about growth rates and what could be achieved in the field, it might be better, this almost sounds crazy now, might be better to actually use a well-tested model and just impose differences in temperature or weather, if you like, across a standard farming system and soil and see what they do. And I did that basically because that's the only way I could get my head around the whole thing. So I used GrassGrow, the CSIRO grazing systems model. Now, because of who you are and where you are, I took 4 locations: Holbrook. Oh, that's Holbrook. That's good, isn't it? Holbrook, Gunning, Mansfield, and Hamilton. I imposed the same farming system. They're just wethers on a Phalaris subclover annual grass pasture, which was reasonably fertile. And I kept the soil type constant. I was just more interested in the weather impact on growth. Now, I took what in GrassGrow is called a tactical approach when I did it. And this is a really useful thing that GrassGrow can do for us. So what I did was I ran the model from 1961 up until the 30th of April this year. I got weather data for each of those locations from the silo site in Queensland, and I ran the model up until that date, right? Then I looked at the outputs of the model and I decided I wanted to eliminate moisture as a problem. So I filled the profile full of moisture, I mean, you know, digitally, if you like, on the 30th of April. So we're starting on the 1st of May with a full profile. And then you can run the model in such a way as it then runs for the period of time that you want, and I ran it from May to August. It then runs through all the weather data, you know, from 1960 to the present. It runs all the weather data for all those next 3 or 4 months, and gives you a distribution of outcomes. You know, what's the median pasture growth rate, etc., etc. I'm going to show you that data now. So here it is, and it's much more than I thought it would be. So this is the average pasture growth rate for each of those months, and this is the median through all the years, and I haven't put the years there, which is slack of me. It's 1991 to 2019. So the median year, say in July at Mansfield, would have grown me for July on average 11 kilos per hectare per day, right? And you can see, and remember, there's almost no soil limitation because I filled the profile up at the start here. So all you're seeing in this May is the pastures basically going gangbusters, pretty much like they have this year in some places. So here they are, Holbrook, Gunning, quite cold in July. So you know, you're down to 8, but most people in Gunning, some of whom might be listening, would be quite happy with 8. Holbrook 16, Mansfield 11, Hamilton 21. We'll probably keep looking at July as I go through. it's worth, all right, so that's just the median year, okay? So 50% of all years are above that from over the period 91 to 2019, and 50% of the years are below that. Let's broaden our view now and just look at what the extremes do. So I'm going to give you the 50th centile, the median, but I'll give you the 10th and 90th as well for each of those. We don't want to dwell on it for too long. So if I'm looking at gunning, what I find for July, let's look at July. I've turned it around if I had to. For July, the 50th centile, like I just said, was 8. That's the median that you just saw. In 10% of years, the growth rate's more than 14. They're the 10% warmest, I dare say, or best years. And in 10% of years, the growth rate is 3 or less, right? And now you can have a look across. At those other sites, and you soon realise why people might want to go to Hamilton, because it's not all that variable in comparison to some of these others. I mean, look at that, 21 down to 14, 50th centile down to 10th centile, right? What's that? That's 2/3. That's 66% of that. This is I don't know what 3/8 is in percents, 37.5% of that. So what you're seeing is some places are a lot more variable from year to year than others. But that'll just give you a bit of an idea. And we're going to come back to that data later, because something quite surprising happens when I take a longer view, which I'm about to do. So if I compared 1991 to 2019, what we've just seen, to 1961 to 1990. Now, I did this for one of my clients, actually, who's listening in tonight. I did it some years ago, and I was quite surprised at the results, so I thought I'd let you in on it. So we're talking about pasture growth. We're talking largely about that temperature-limited time in winter, and this happens. Now, I'm going to show you one for each of those sites, but here we have on the left-hand side, we've got gunning. We've run our tactical grass grow analysis from 61 to 90 here. We have exactly what you just saw, those 4 months, May to August. Let's just concentrate for now, well, on the 50th centile, the median year. So in the median year, over 61 to 90, say for July, all you could do is grow 4 kilos per hectare per day. But if you look over the same period, the same month rather, in the 91 to 2019 data, you get double that. All right. Now, if you have a look right across that graph now, you largely see just increases right across the board. Okay. So, for instance, look at August. Median year, 23 kilos per hectare per day. Out of the later time series, the median year for the earlier time series, 61 to 90, is only 15. Now, what I'm going to show is just the rest of them. We don't need to labour the point. It's pretty clear what's happening. More so at the first 3 than at Hamilton. I know Hamilton's near perfect anyway, so you couldn't get any better, could you? Here's Holbrook. Holbrook again, July, median year, going from 9, 61 to 90, right up to 16 in the 91 to 2019. Remember, I filled up the water profile, so this doesn't include effects of drought, all right? Okay, we're only looking at winter growth rates when we're limited by temperature, largely, as much as I could control it, which isn't that much anyway. Anyway, you could go through the data. You might want to go through it yourselves, but it's the same story. Here's Mansfield. Same deal, 11 versus 6, 24 versus 19, etc., etc. Probably the least impressive difference was in Hamilton, where there's a bit of a difference, but it's much smaller. Look, July, 21 kilos. In the earlier period, it was 18 kilos, and they're much more marginal changes there. So that's now what we've been talking about is the growth rate, kilos per hectare per day. What would happen? Oh, all right. No, sorry. I'll go on with this first, and I'll show you something else I didn't see. So we are heating up, and the pastures know it. There's no reason to think the model would be biased. It's part of a, global conspiracy. For people who do modelling and stuff, I suppose this means a lot, and even for farmers as well. Using really long historical data sets is rather problematic, particularly right? If you know there's been some sort of change, and it appears, if I was saying what would be the expected growth rate in a winter where there was moisture about, I wouldn't be actually basing that on on I don't know. Well, on that sort of data that you've just seen, I wouldn't be going back to the 60s and use those in the distribution, because I think they might be a bit irrelevant now. What does it mean? Well, I've got implications for nitrogen, which I'm going to do in a sec, but I meant to show this a bit earlier. Now, this is what happens in over those 4 months, right? What I did then was I accumulated the growth rates into how much pasture would be grown. So over that period, so in the 61 to 90 period, in the median year, then I would have grown 1,880 kilos per hectare over that period, 2401, 1973, 3081. But the big thing is, have a look at the differences. 1,800 or so to 2,400, 2,400 to 3,000, 1,973, 2,527, 3,080 in the less affected Hamilton to 3,358. So that's just another way of saying what I've already told you, and I dare say it would work out for the 10th centile year or any other, doesn't really matter. The point is it's getting warmer, and that's going to have implications also for nitrogen. How am I going for time, Hillary?
All good.
She's not talking to me. All good, good. Okay, responses to nitrogen. Temperature independently influences two processes here that might interest us. First of it is demand. How fast can the plant grow, right? Now, we've seen that. And we've seen the sort of growth rates, and we'll come back and use them in a calculation in a moment, the sort of growth rates that we could possibly achieve in those environments over the winter period. But the other one is the supply. How fast nitrogen can be made available from soil organic matter. Some people make a few little mistakes here. Please realise that most of the nitrogen, the vast majority of the nitrogen that are pasture sources in a year, I should do this right. The vast majority of nitrogen that are pasture sources in a year in a system which is not reliant or heavily reliant on your applications of nitrogen-based fertilisers, like a lot of our beef, sheep, dryland systems are. Most of the nitrogen will be sourced from organic matter that is mineralized to an available form. It's most critical that you get that. Some people, I've read some stuff from some government agencies which worried me this week. Anyway, so mineralization is the term given to the processes, all the processes together that convert organic matter to available forms, largely ammonium and nitrate. There are other little terms that you could learn, but they don't matter that much. And what we're talking about is the sort of stuff that Richard Eckhart showed a few weeks ago. Essentially, here is a nitrogen cycle of some sort. There's a whole lot of detail here that you don't have to get too excited about, but in the middle of it all is an animal, which is great, who's eating pasture. Some of the pasture goes through the animal and ends up as urine and dung. Some of the pasture just rots and goes into organic matter. Actually, most of us only eat at the most 40 to 50% of the pasture, so at least half of it is just rotting in the soil at some stage and going into the soil organic matter. That, in this mineralization process, gets converted to ammonium and eventually some of that to nitrate, which can be taken up by plants. Now, so the point is, though, the major point is that this process down here, where the ammonium and the nitrate are made, it requires the activity of microorganisms in the soil, and is extremely, as a result, is extremely temperature sensitive. Now, of course, the other big input that we're not talking about today, but I always put it in a talk like this, that just remember, for every tonne of legume you grow, there's about 20 kilos of nitrogen being fixed and entering the system. Now, some of that will rot down, some of that will enter the mouth, round and round and round we go. All very nice. What if we wanted to see some figures? Now, very quickly from New Zealand, I was telling Hillary earlier, they tend to do better pasture work than us a lot of the time. Don't know why. Anyway, play rugby better than us too. Anyway, here we go. All right, I've just put down. Oh, here we go. That's good. All right, I just clicked all that sort of stuff. So again, pretty much just like I told you, here is the big pool of organic matter. Forget about the different forms. I don't care about that. Organic matter. Here's soil inorganic matter. This is the mineralization process going from the organic matter to inorganic matter, some of which is taken up by the pasture, eaten by the animal, or plant litter. The animal dungs it or urines it. It comes back into the system and on we go. But this is a flow. Nitrogen flows from a clover-based pasture in New Zealand that's had 1.9 tonnes of super and 1.3 tonnes of lime over 4 years, stocked with 12 sheep per hectare. I love this work. And of course the other major inputs, nitrogen fixation, so I didn't do that. Okay, some numbers. So in this pasture system, 268 kilos of nitrogen is taken up from the inorganic pool. 135 enters from nitrogen fixation. The animal eats, so that's actually, what's that all up? It's about 403 kilos of nitrogen going into the pasture a year. The animal eats 163 kilos, and 240 kilos goes back into the system via plant litter. 9 goes out as animal product, 34 goes as dung from the animal, and 120 as urine, which goes straight into the inorganic pool. Now, I think, oh yeah, there's a bit of fertiliser, there's deposition from the sky, there's a bit of nitrate leaching and gaseous losses, not talking about it, don't care. What I want you to realise, though, is that most of the nitrogen that comes into the system comes from the inorganic pool, and most of the nitrogen, well, there's 120 going in as urine, but most of the nitrogen that comes out of that originally came from this organic pool. Now, if it came from the organic pool, the rate at which it converts from organic matter to mineral nitrogen becomes very important, and it's very sensitive to temperature. Here is now, this is a wheat field. I could find data for pastures and did, but I tended to like this little data set better, and the actual rates of mineralization didn't disagree that much anyway. So here we've got the net mineralization rate, and here we've got air temperature. Air temperature is the a hollow circle. The mineralization rate is the upside down solid triangle, and you can see they track each other quite well. Well, there's a very good reason for that. Other studies have shown it like a direct straight line relationship between, as long as the soil's moist, between temperature and mineralization. Now, so you can see it going down quite drastically as the temperature's getting cold. So if we did some calculations, just go back to that. I'll just show. Have a look at just look at this rate here. This is like 0.2. Is 0.2 of a kilo. When we're at our least, we're sort of around 0.2-ish in the July-August period. Let's just pretend that that's a general thing. Just for a moment, when you see those calculations, you'll get my point. So July gunning. Now, July gunning, we saw the median pasture rate from 1991 to 2019 was 8 kilos per hectare per day, but that's only the tops. Let's just assume the plant's putting a third of what it gets into the roots. So the whole growth rate for the pasture, whole system would be 12 kilos per hectare per day. Let's say the demand for nitrogen, so let's say in order to grow it needed about 3% nitrogen. It'll be around there. It won't be much different. It might be 2.7, I don't know, but whatever. Could be even higher. The leaves will be 4%, the roots will be less, etc., etc. So that would mean that the growth rate demand would come in at 3% of 12, which is 360. Geez, I hope it is. I didn't use my calculator. 360 grams per day. But you remember what you just saw. We saw a mineralization rate in that slow period there in July, August of 200 grams per day. And so therefore we have quite a big difference between what the plant could do, right? That is, if unlimited soil moisture was, that's how I did my growth rates, unlimited soil moisture, or close to it. Unlimited soil moisture, plant, pasture growing fairly well on a fertile soil. It could grow to 8, but it probably wouldn't, right? If its demand, it's 8 kilos per hectare, could not be met by the supply. Now, mineralization looks to be probably the big the choke on that system over that period. So mineralization is too slow to allow growth to proceed, assuming available N levels are low, and that's most likely by July. There are other factors, of course, that affect mineralization, notably pH, soil moisture, the organic matter, the amount, and also the C to N ratio, disturbance, soil type, and a whole lot of other stuff. So it's not as if I don't know that, but I'm just emphasising at the moment this temperature business. As winter temperatures warm, is it likely that this difference will become greater? Well, it may well do. Yeah, it may well do. And I wanted to show you, this is a bit of old work that we did at Wagga years ago, but this is the amount of, in this case, it's nitrate. It is soil nitrate. So it's one of the forms of nitrogen, which is the product of the mineralization process. You'll just notice, all I want you to notice is the black symbol is a pure subclover pasture. The hollow symbols are perennials. Forget about Danthonia, just go Phalaris or Lucerne. Phalaris is square, Lucerne the triangle. What you'll notice there is, when there is a whole lot of mineralization occurs early on in the autumn, when you get a bit of rain, the organic matter starts being broken down by the bugs because it's moist and it's warm, gets broken down. You get a big bulge of nitrate in a pasture like subclover, because it's just germinating and can't use it all up yet. So that's understandable. And indeed, as the season progresses from June to August, that bulge starts to move down the profile beyond the root zone of the subclover. All very interesting. The thing I really want you to notice is what happens to the amount of nitrate in the soil where you've got perennials, and essentially it's almost always close to zero. So in other words, it's not as if there's this big pool of soil nitrate in perennial pastures that can be drawn down. It's never like that. So if the mineralization does not keep pace with plant growth, then that will be a real limitation, and that might be why we get a response to urea. If we look at, we're very close to finishing now, but if we look at a series of experiments in the 1960s, now I did see Richard Eckard's, and it was great because it had all that ryegrass work, but for some of us who live in colder environments, it's worth thinking about what happens when we put nitrogen on in really cold places, like Canberra. So Simpson worked in and around Canberra in the 60s. There are some interesting results. And remember, at a time when temperatures were probably a little bit lower than they are today. Urea was applied to ryegrass or Phalaris pastures. Typical temperatures that you might get over the months where he was interested were up here. Here's air temperatures. So we're getting down to mean weekly air temperatures of 5 degrees through that July sort of period, there and abouts for the different years in which the work was done. I didn't want to say much about ground temperatures, and because this is at 5 centimetres or 2 inches, as it says down there, we just don't have a lot of responses available to us or modelling available to us in response to ground temperatures. So I tend to leave it as it's a bit of a shame, because it would be more useful, particularly from the mineralisation aspect. Let's have a look at some of his work. This is a ryegrass pasture. Now, the ryegrass is applied here on July the 12th in Canberra, and these are the rates down here. Now, they are in pounds per acre, but you can basically call that kilos per hectare. Here's the yield in pounds per acre, basically call it kilos per hectare. And what we're getting here, quite interestingly, is a response of 850 over 40 in that period, which is quite amazing, which was a response of 21 kilos of dry matter per kilo of N. Just like that's as big as he ever found, I might add too. Other other work that was done. So it depends actually when you do it, and it also depends when you measure it too. So here's another one. If you look at the next figure, here's an application of 80 kilos of nitrogen. I'm only interested in the red one. 80 kilos of nitrogen on June the 7th. 80 kilos of nitrogen on June the 7th. Looking at the harvest. I did the work. Yeah, I did the work earlier. It gave us in the end a return of only 6.25 kilos of nitrogen. Anybody who watched Richard's talk would realise that that would be rather a marginal return. It'd be a poor return on investment. But there is a time of there is a bit of a time of harvest. So here is nitrogen applied on July the 19th. So we're right in the middle of winter again. But if I harvest early, 40 kilos, this is the extra growth, if you like, that was achieved. There's hardly anything. If I leave it for a bit longer, then I'm getting a fair bit back. I didn't do a calculation for that one, but all it said to me was, though, that we have to be a little bit careful in how we measure these things, because quite clearly, if you measure before the pasture has started to, while it's really, really cold, like this is, what's this? It's 7 weeks after, but this is only 9 weeks after. The answers are very, very different. So you have to be just a bit careful with that. Overall, what's really stunning about those Canberra experiments is they conclude very similar to what Richard did with the ryegrass stuff, that you could conclude an efficiency of around 10 kilos of dry matter on average per kilo of nitrogen. They concluded that was an appropriate benchmark for fertilising those types of pastures with around 40 to 80 kilos of nitrogen as urea. As expected, the results are a function of prevailing conditions, particularly soil moisture. And many of these occurred on soils with a particularly low, with a reasonably low nitrogen status, I should say, with a short history of pasture improvement. There's a key quote over that I got from the paper, which I shared with some folk down on the Monero a few years ago. And it's this. An earlier worker, Blackman, found that the main response of ryegrass to applied nitrogen occurred when the soil temperature, it kills me this sort of stuff, but anyway, at 4 inches depth was in the range 5.6 to 8.3 degrees Celsius. Below this range, growth did not occur. And that's where I think some of the chat that you always hear that, once soil temperature gets to 5 degrees, growth doesn't occur. You hear that a bit. This is the only source I could ever find for it. Below this range, growth did not occur, and above 8.3 degrees, mineralization of soil nitrogen increased sufficiently to reduce the response. Considering the mean weekly soil temperatures in Figure 1, the mean for 1961-62 can be seen to lie within Blackman's limits. So basically, what he's really saying in all of that is saying, well, look, there is a part of the year where we will be there, where mineralization will be limited, between this 5 and 8 degrees, where mineralization will be limiting, but growth will be able to occur, and that's why we get the sort of responses. It means that you are not running a bad system if you put a bit of nitrogen on in winter and you get a response. You don't have to be thinking, my God, am I using enough phosphate? Am I doing this right or that right? You just say, the reason that occurs is mineralization isn't happening fast enough to satisfy the growth demand. I could almost stop there. There's excellent data from Richard Eckard's recent webinars in this series for other people who are involved in ryegrass to look through it. And I said the other thing about the 10 kilo thing from Richard's talk and other work that you see done, use of calculators, etc., that it makes economic sense at 10 kilos of dry matter per kilo of nitrogen applied. That makes economic sense. Below that, the returns are pretty poor. Challenge for the future is there's not much really available on non-ryegrass pastures, and that's a bit of a shame. Because in my personal observation, I would say this: I've found it, and so has my business partner Nathan, we've found it very hard to predict responses, and we tend to put out strips sometimes to convince us of the worth and the merit of the exercise. But sometimes we get fantastic responses, and in very similar situations we get nothing. And yeah, there's a fair bit more work's got to go into it, I think, for us to make a much more efficient utilisation of that nitrogen. Obviously, when average temperatures are too low for pasture growth, you know, when you get to that point, you get to a point in some places, but it's so low that pastures can't grow, well, don't expect a response. Summary of tonight's talk is pretty simple. Temperature governs plant development and has a large impact on growth. Pasture growth rates are closely related to temperature when other factors are controlled. Pasture growth rates can be very low in winter, but have increased as, presumably, temperature has increased over the last, largely over the last 30 years, noticeably. Finally, pastures respond to nitrogen in winter when demand outstrips supply. So if your pasture responds to nitrogen in winter, perhaps it's just a sign that the soil bugs can't keep up with you. Cheers, and that's it.
Great, thank you very much for that, Jim. Definitely gave our listeners some updated information on the effects of temperature and certainly pasture growth rates. So that was some interesting information there, and lucky to those guys in Gunning and Mansfield, and you've got a few more kilos under your belt, so no excuses. I'll just give Jim a little bit of a break. If you do have to head off now, actually, before I do mention that, Jim also mentioned Richard Eckard's webinars. These webinars are recorded and are available on the MLA website. So they're under resources and extension. All the webinars are up there and can be viewed at any time. And Jim's will go up there in the next few days. If you do have to head off early, please take the time to do the end of webinar survey. These surveys give us feedback for the presenters and the facilitators at Homesucket and MLA to make sure that the webinars are hitting the right areas. All right, I'll just start with some questions. So if you do have any, send them through. And I'll get on to them now. The first one from Steve, if you're ready to go, Jim. Are there any studies looking at the effect of the number of cloud days as opposed to temperature on photosynthesis and pasture growth?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of work that's been done in terms of the physiology on, well, it's not so much cloud days, it would be on the amount of what they call photosynthetically active radiation, but it's just the light that turns on, the light levels that turn on photosynthesis, the amount of that, those levels, and the response of of both leaf photosynthesis and canopy photosynthesis. So that sort of work's being done, and on a broader scale, right? When you look at what's a good way of saying, when you look at say if you looked at moisture, right, temperature and light, and you compared the three through the year, there's a great bit of old work done by Henry Nix in a book that was called Australian Grasslands. But when you look at that, there's a chapter, and the studies have been repeated a few times, but they just looked at the limitations to growth posed by those three influences, that is temperature, soil moisture, and light. Light is usually not a huge influence. It has some influence, particularly over winter, particularly as you go more south in Australia, but usually during that time temperature is a bigger influence. So what light will do is it will reduce the growth again, right? I might just say all that modelling I did was using light that would be expected in those environments. So that light's taken into account. But usually temperature is the bigger limitation in most environments at that time of year. All right. And of course, as we move into summer, temperature is not a limitation, right? Hardly at all. And of course, soil moisture becomes the big influencer, and light is certainly not an influencer at all. But yeah, there have been studies on that sort of stuff. It's been some time since I've been familiar with them, though.
Right. Thank you for the question. David would just like to say, not a question, but a good job on explaining what happens over both seasons and the longer time. So thanks for the feedback, David. The next question, with stock grazing pasture, what would be the safe limit for a urea application?
Well, I think there's a couple of things in there. Safe, to me, here we go. I can't stand this question. I'll tell you the truth. Here we go. So the problem is, if we're worried about nitrate poisoning, okay, then it's a question really of the way I look at it. It's a question of doing what the book says. You know, waiting a few weeks and then putting the stock on. Right. I would think actually what should determine the limit was not the fear of nitrate poisoning, but the likely response. And some of that growth curve stuff that I showed earlier, and may or may not have, there may be some other stuff, really shows that there's not much point at all putting on, I don't think much above 80 kilos of nitrogen per hectare in one hit. Okay, now others might disagree. Others say 200 kilos of urea or something like that. But I think that would determine the upper limit rather than the fear of nitrate poisoning. Now, I know there's somebody out there who's now going to ring and say, I killed all my sheep with nitrate poisoning. But I have to say, you know, sometimes I think that more productivity has been gone through the fear of nitrate poisoning than has been gained through the application of urea. So I just think we give up a little opportunity sometimes. Or there's been more, so I'll do it again, more production has been foregone than through not putting it on, than through putting it on and watching a couple of animals die every so often, which is hardly ever at all, except for the one person who's about to make a rude comment wherever you are.
Thanks, Jim. A few questions coming in about ProGib. I'll try and tie them into one. I guess, do you have an input on the use of ProGib and its impact of dry matter production through these cooler months?
Yeah, it's good. Look, you know, there's been enough work on ProGib to sink a ship now. We've had a few seminars on it and stuff like that. I think there's one in the webinar series. What are we really looking at? Well, the interesting thing about phalaris-based pastures is they're so responsive to ProGib. So if you're putting out, oh God, here we go, 4 grams of active. Mostly we're putting out around 15 grams of ProGib. What's that? Is that 6 grams of active? I think that is. And that's giving a good response in a phalaris, you know, in a good phalaris pasture. You might be upping the rates too if you're more if there's more like ryegrass or cocksfoot is what you've got. In the cooler months, yep, that's the time to do it. And it's talking about the efficiency of returns. That's the cheapest. It's much cheaper than urea. And so they'll give in most circumstances, of course, making the point that we always should, that it's only cheap, of course, if you utilise the extra feed. Have a look around, determine whether you really need to do it or whether you just do it because you just do it. I think there's a lot of farmers now after the dry period who are understocked, and after a fantastic autumn, there's plenty of feed. I wouldn't be pulling out the spray cart because I do it every year. I'd be having a look at my situation, doing a bit of thinking. Probably better ways to spend money if you're in the situation of not having enough stock and having too much pasture. Sorry about that, I'm preaching. Sorry.
Good point, Jim. No, and next week we've got Bruce Allworth talking about managing bloat in cattle, so he might back you up on that one. So the next question from Ken is, does accelerate result in more kilograms of dry matter or just look like more? Do you know?
I don't know what accelerate is. What's that? Is that a ProGib? Is that a gibberellic-based product? Or I don't know what accelerate.
Assume that it is, if you can, Jim, and if not, Ken, can you just rewrite the question, please?
Yeah. I'll just have. You're not seeing my screen now, are you?
Yeah. Oh, do you want me to put mine on?
Yeah, may as well.
We'll get up the photo of you.
Oh. No. Yeah. Oh, accelerate gibberellic acid. There you go.
Okay,
Accelerate 200. Okay, so it's just I wasn't used to. So the answer is no. There's a number of known effects of gibberellin, and the answer is one, that applying gibberellin increases photosynthetic rate a bit. It probably changes the. Sorry, I'm just turning my phone off. It changes, has an influence on the amount of dry matter that gets partitioned. So you've got the carbon coming in through photosynthesis. How much of it goes to the roots? How much of it goes to the tops? Gibberellin has an influence on that and putting more into the tops, so we harvest more. All right. So no, that's a real growth effect. It's not just how it looks. Yes, I would agree, though, that it always looks more sensational than it is, but it is a real effect. There's no doubt about that. Only at the heavier rates of gibberellin do you get a decrease in growth further on in the season. It doesn't tend to occur at the lower rates, but no, it's a real dry matter effect, even if it looks more sensational than it actually is.
Great, thank you for the question, Ken. The next one from James. Turnips and nitrogen, is there a return on investment?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Look, the only way to answer that question is there might be no answer to that question. This is what I mean. It would depend on how well fertilised the system was and what the dry matter response of the turnips were. I mean, I just can't say. You know, I just couldn't say.
That's fine.
Sorry.
No worries. Consult your local agronomist to work that one out, I think.
Well, yeah.
Together.
Put out a strip. I always think, I'll just say something, something quite interesting about a question like that is, John, I won't say his name, a CSIRO scientist who worked with nitrogen and wheat for a long time, some of you might know who I'm talking about now, all of the work and all the tools and all of the things that could help you understand, strategies with nitrogen and wheat and stuff like that. One of the best was to undersow a whole lot of nitrogen as urea under the crop, in just a strip of it, right? Like a whole lot we're talking about, and watch the difference between that strip and the crop for the rest of the season, right? And if that strip continued to be different, right, you'd start saying, well, I am still responsive to nitrogen. And so what amazed me about that comment, which he made, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, is all the stuff that we've got, and in the end, it's a simple strip, a simple test in the paddock that would determine whether you go out and do more. Now, I hope I haven't got that wrong, but I don't think I have. I found it a fascinating, I do nitrogen budgets and all that sort of stuff, but in the end, I found that a fascinating way to basically, found that fascinating in the sense that we were looking at a very, very practical way compared to all the calculations and all the stuff you could possibly do. It was just a very simple, much more simple method. And I dare say putting nitrogen on might be one of the best ways to answer that question.
Thanks, Jim. The next one from James. Could you make a comment on frost and pasture quality? Old wives' tales about frost hardening up the feed. I don't know what that means, if anything. Thank you.
Yes, hardening up the feed. I'm not quite sure. I do think sometimes the effect of frost, you see that it yellows off some species more than others. I would expect the loss of chlorophyll and probably proteins with it might see a diminution in feed quality. Yep, that problem, hardening off the feed, I'm not sure I'd use that term. Would I expect some impact on the frost-affected parts of the plant in terms of quality? Yeah, I'd expect them to decline if they lost, those contents that make them more digestible. The proteins, the sugars, etc., etc. So I don't think it's all old wives' tales, but hardening off, doesn't sound like an appropriate term to me.
Great, thanks for the question. The next one from Richard. Jim, if I were to implement an economically upper amount of N, can you give an indication of amount and regularity of reapplication?
Sorry, I think I'd need to know what your system was to answer that properly. So I'll just, I'll give you an example. Sorry, Richard, I can't really help you out with that unless I knew more about your system. So if we were talking about, say we went to that Canberra one, right? Well, you're almost told in that little quote at the end that by the time in the season that mineralization starts to go a bit faster. So imagine you have, I'll go back a step. Imagine we've got a well-fertilized, say, phalaris clover pasture. Phosphate's been really good history of production. One could only assume a fair bit of organic matter, so reasonable job. As we move into spring, nitrogen's not going to be the problem, most likely, right? Because mineralisation keeps going and it'll probably keep up with the pasture demand. So we're really talking about giving it a hit earlier in the year. I still think, despite some of those results I showed, I still think there's promise for some of those responses in autumn. In the coldest places, the coldest of the coldest, the midwinter doesn't sound sensible to me. But it's more about putting shoulders on the winter season. But I'd only be thinking about one application, maybe time for one application. But these are in a system where most of the nitrogen, the vast majority of the nitrogen, is ultimately sourced through nitrogen fixation, not through urea. If you're in a system where it's urea alone, I still wouldn't imagine it's worth putting. I still wouldn't imagine I'd go much above 100 kilos of urea each time, and I wouldn't imagine. I just couldn't imagine how often I'd have to do it. Speak to a dairy farmer. I can't help you if you're in that sort of system.
Great, thank you. The next one from Jim. Jim, at what temperature would you say a winter active lucerne, says say 11, stops growing, like average temperature?
So I really wish I could answer that. I really don't know. My thought about those things is, though, that, okay, so I don't know the answer to that question. So the difference between our semi-winter dormants, I mean, we don't really have any hard winter dormant ones like they do in the States, I don't think, in Australia, which, they have to exist under snow and stuff like that for long periods. So I really don't know. I think it's problematic when we overemphasize the difference between, in terms of growth, between the dormancy groups in lucerne. All right, I don't think it's that big. Okay, it never dictates to me. It never dictates at all the lucernes that we use. I'm a persistence man, unfortunately, so I tend to emphasise persistence above everything else. So I have to tell you, but I don't know the answer to your question. I wish that sort of data was readily available. I don't think it is.
That's fine. No worries. Thanks for the question. The next one from David. You said there was limited information on this, but the temperatures presented are air temperatures. Can you touch on the relative role of soil temperatures versus air temperature and the impact of pasture growth?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think actually that if we had, so I'll just go back a step. All the pasture models, or the two pasture models in Australia that are used to give us growth rates and give us an idea of what might be going on, are all based on air temperature, right? And so published relations also between, say, temperature and growth, etc., really don't exist or exist very rare for ground temperature. Okay, and then we have a problem that when you do get some ground temperature data, it's either 5 centimetres deep or 10 centimetres deep, and so we don't even have a really good. and our Bureau of Meteorology doesn't have a very, very vast set of ground temperatures. So it's pretty difficult. It's pretty difficult. I think it would be great if we did, though, right? Because, particularly say at 5 centimetres, because you know that some processes, and this has been shown too, that some processes are a lot more sensitive to ground temperature than, or even surface temperature, than air temperature. Yeah, we just don't have the data there to help us understand those relationships. Another example would be, say, mineralization in soil. Now, that's one where air temperature, even though that graph I showed you earlier was air temperature, but it would make much more sense to take the temperature in the top 2 centimetres of the soil, where the vast majority of mineralization is going on. So I would sympathise with anybody about the lack of data and the lack of appropriate relationships, but I hear people say these things all the time, like, growth stops when soil temperature gets to 5 degrees. Well, what's that, man? Is it soil temperature at 10 centimetres or 5 centimetres? Is it and you can see why it would occur and why it's so important in a way, and that's because air temperature bounces around like nothing else, but you've got this massive heat capacitance in the soil, so you get sort of seasonal influences, right, as it goes down, but it doesn't jitter around a whole lot once you go down 5 centimetres in soil. So it's a much more stable measurement of the temperature environment, but this, lack of usable data is the problem there, I'm afraid.
Thanks. Thank you for the question, David. The next one, Jim, might just be a clarification question. You're saying that in midwinter, mineralization of N will not be enough to supply pasture growth and therefore need to apply N fertilizer. However, won't the soil temp be too low for growth anyway?
Yeah, so that's right. Depends. Look, the answer to that is depends where you are, doesn't it? Okay, so if you in some environments that would be the case, in other environments it would not. So it just would depend. It would just depend where you are in the world. My guess would be an environment where I am tonight in Wagga. I would say we would probably, in a perennial pasture, would probably not reach or very rarely reach the temperature, the bottom end temperature for any pasture growth for a month. That'd be extremely rare. Sorry, as long as there's soil moisture available. Okay, assuming there's soil moisture available. So I think I'm not trying to avoid the question, but it would really depend on where you're thinking about. If I went, to a very cold environment, up near the mountain, up in really, really cold country where it might snow, then it would definitely be the case that growth would get down to zero for a while. And of course, I would say that even if you made the mistake of putting nitrogen on, it's probably not lost, right? You'll use it, but it'll just take longer. It'll take longer it'll take longer to see the response in your pasture, but it will occur. It almost always does.
Great.
Yeah, but I can't answer it directly because it is very location based.
That's no worries. The next one, any comment on AN nitrogen products versus urea, quickness on plant availability through cooler periods and its efficiency? Do you know what AN is?
Can you is that AN, is that
could you just clarify what that is, Kyle? And we'll jump on to the next one. Oh, nitrate-based, sorry.
Oh, well, the only, there's one sure thing. Nitrate-based fertilisers aren't going to volatilise, so there's something for you. If you're unlucky, though, you might lose a whole lot pretty quickly in a leaching event. Price would be the major determinant, though, I would say. So I'd be looking at my price. Yeah, I would be looking at my price. I mean, I certainly, if it didn't blow things up and it was cheap enough, I think ammonium nitrate would be a great fertiliser, but it's not available. ammonium sulfate, of course, is pretty acidifying. I just don't think the price works out either for it. So I think it'd be. I would look at it through the cost lens more than anything else. Oh, sorry, through the return lens. Through the profit that I could make from that investment.
Thank you. Last few questions. Jim, is plantain's winter growth rate worth considering even though its total dry matter production may be limited?
Well, look, yes. I guess the only thing I'd add is I think you've got to make those decisions. Once again, I'm going to probably go into my flee to my natural bias, which is for persistence and getting a return out of all that cost of establishing stuff. So if the plantain lasts long enough, I do think timeliness of feed production is extremely important. So interestingly, somebody talked about lucens a bit earlier. An early study in Australia of a whole lot of dormancy groups found that the annual dry matter production difference between those groups is next to nothing. But the timeliness was that there was a little bit more winter production in the less winter dormant or the so-called winter active cultivars. So I'd say the same sort of thing for plantain. If the winter growth rates are superior, but it's not doing as much at the rest of the year, and that is a big time when you're jammed up, and the plantain persists. I don't see a problem, really. I don't see a problem with it at all. I don't think you should. So I don't think we should all be growing necessarily the stuff that grows the most feed the year round, right? Because you can get a fair bit of value out of high quality feed out of season. Lucerne is a classic example. It does not grow the most feed on a year-round basis, I think, but its ability to respond to out-of-season rainfall and grow a reasonable amount of feed the rest of the time is exceptional. And of course, its persistence works for you as well.
Thank you for the question. Last one from Christine. It's a bit of a wild one. Any data on dry matter growth responses to N application at low temperatures on subtropical pasture species?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't help you with that. You'd be best, look, I'd give Sue Boschmer at DPI in Tamworth a ring. She might be the best person to talk to about that. Or Bob Freeban, actually, the guy who does the column in the land. They might be able to gear you up on that stuff. I just don't operate in that. I don't operate in that playpen.
Excellent. Well, that's all we have for tonight. Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for answering those questions. Thank you, everyone, for sending questions in. Next week, we have Bruce Allworth, who will be talking to us about managing bloat in cattle. But that's all for tonight. So thanks again, Jim. That was a really great presentation.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Get rid of that photo. Get rid of that photo.
I'll get a new one.
See ya.